Last week, Derrick Henry, Ken Walker, Nico Collins, Justin Fields, DeAndre Swift, and Baker Mayfield went off in fantasy football and helped people win their matchup. In this video, I'm giving you 10 names that will do the same in week number 5. Guys that will win you your matchup. My hit rate through 4 weeks is 65%. Let's keep this thing rolling, baby. It is wheels up for the Baba Yaga himself, Dontavion Wicks, the waiver wire pickup of the week. He is going straight into my lineups where I lost Rashee Rice. It's a double dip here with both Wicks and Josh Jacobs to start the video. They face the Rams, who give up the 6th most points to the running back and the wide receiver position. So very good matchups for both Wicks and Josh Jacobs. Let's look at what the Rams defense has done against wide receivers this year. In week 1, Jameson Williams goes off. Then Marvin Harrison has his breakout game against his team with 29 fantasy points. Then Jawan Jennings has the best game of any wide receiver this year versus the secondary with 46 points and 3 passing touchdowns. And remember, last week without Christian Watson, Dontavion Wicks had 13 targets, caught 5 of them, 78 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. Now look, obviously, 13 targets is an unrealistic expectation to have, considering the Packers were down the entire game last week versus the Minnesota Vikings. However, the encouraging sign is that Wicks led this wide receiver room in target share by far. Don't believe me? Well, let's have a look. Wicks had 26% of the target share last week, where Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs were at 16%. And Dontavion Wicks is seeing a career high in snaps because of the Christian Watson injury. So he is absolutely in play this week. And so is Josh Jacobs. If you look at the Rams defense against running backs, they're getting torched. Gibbs and Monty both had around 17 points. Then James Conner with 19 points. Then last week, DeAndre Swift, who was completely dead, had a incredible game, 29.5 fantasy points, 165 total yards. He dominated this defense. All he needed was the Rams to kind of figure something out. And I know last week was really strange for Josh Jacobs. He wasn't really used as much as we wanted him to. But to be fair, let's think about the game script for a second. Last week, the Packers were down to the Vikings the entire game. They were down 28-0 in the second quarter, guys. There was not a single moment that the Packers could establish the run. So that's a very good reason as to why Josh Jacobs never got going. And regardless of the position here, running back, wide receiver, the Rams defense has been one of the worst defenses in the NFL, point blank period. In 2024, they give up the most rushing yards per game, the second most total yards per game, and they give up the second most total points to opposing offenses. And by the way, this is the second highest over-under of the week, 48.5 points. So the fantasy gods, Vegas themselves is saying there should be a lot of fantasy cheese in this one. I'm saying Wicks has 6 catches, at least 15 PPR points. And I think Josh Jacobs gets back on track, 17 plus touches, 80 plus total yards, and 15 plus PPR points. All right, the next player we'll talk about, and this is assuming, okay, that JT does not play in week 5. That is Trey Sermon at the Jags. Yeah, I know. What the hell is this guy talking about? He's telling me to start Trey Sermon? Absolutely. Do you know how many people are on bye? Do you know how many injuries people are dealing with? Trey Sermon is a great play, a top 20 play, my RB17 this week, going up against the Jags, who give up the 7th most points to fantasy running backs. Over 24 points per game they're giving up to running backs. This year, they gave Achane 23 points. They gave James Cook 18.7 PPR points. And their defense is getting roasted right now. They give up the 3rd most total yards to opposing offenses, and they give up the 3rd most points to opposing offenses, almost 4 touchdowns per game worth of points. And friendly reminder, we have seen backup running backs for JT come in and dominate when he goes out with an injury. Just last year, Zach Moss steps in multiple times and dominates. He's a must start every time JT is out. And remember, before the 2023 season, no one had a strong opinion on Zach Moss. It's not like anyone was like, Zach Moss is a good running back. His numbers before last year were completely mediocre, but last year in any game where he played 50+% of the snaps, he averaged over 16 points per game. So why can't Trey Sermon do the same exact thing? I think he gets 15 plus touches if he's a starter, 70 plus total yards, and at least 15 fantasy points. All right, that takes us to my spicy, hot, bold take of the week. I love these. I hope you guys love them too. In week 5, the rookie, Brian Thomas Jr. is going to dominate the Indianapolis Colts secondary by putting up 100 plus receiving yards and 17 PPR points. He's going to go off, all right? The Jags give up the 10th most points to fantasy wide receivers, almost 30 points per game. And in week 1, they let Nico Collins get 17.7 PPR points. They let Stephon Diggs have 21.9 fantasy points. And just last week, George Pickens, who didn't have a single game over 15 PPR points, has 7 catches, 113 yards, and a season-high 16.3 PPR points. This defense is getting toasted. They're allowing the 7th most passing yards per game and the most total yards per game of any defense. I mean, they're almost giving up 400 yards to opposing offenses. It's absolutely nutty. And look, beyond those numbers, even the defensive scheme that the Colts are using is going to heavily favor Brian Thomas Jr. this week. Shout out to Jacob Gibbs over on Twitter. Great work. Big fan of what he does. And he tweeted out recently, no defense uses cover 3 more than the Indianapolis Colts. He goes on to say, well, which Jags wide receiver is going to benefit the most? Well, that is the alpha wide receiver, the number 1, and that is going to be Brian Thomas. We know that. So why is this so important for Brian Thomas? Well, if you look, Brian Thomas Jr. is averaging 0.63 fantasy points per route run against cover 3 schemes. He's absolutely obliterating cover 3, and that's what the Colts love to do with this secondary. I don't know why, but they love it. So Brian Thomas Jr. is set to feast. And in the last 2 weeks, Brian is becoming a focal point of this offense, averaging 9 targets per game in both of the last 2 games. I believe he gets at least 6 catches, 100 plus yards, and 17 PPR points this week. That takes me to my quarterback streamer of the week. That is BCB, Brock Purdy, Glock Purdy versus the Arizona Cardinals, my quarterback 7 on the week. Arizona gives up the 4th most points to fantasy quarterbacks, almost 20 points per game. And the Cardinals defense has been getting roasted by some of the best quarterbacks this year. Josh Allen went off over 31 points. Jaden Daniels just last week had one of his best career games, 25 fantasy points. And personally, I believe this is about the 49ers offense finally gelling, finally coming together and having that game where we look at their performance and say, that's the 2023 49ers that I remember. So the good news is Brock Purdy has Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, and Juwan Jennings all healthy, just missing CMC. And last year, Brock Purdy averaged 23.5 fantasy points against the Cardinals. That's in 6-point passing touchdown formats. And he had a game in the second half of the season versus the Cardinals where he threw 4 passing touchdowns. He dominates this team pretty consistently. And this is the highest over-under of the week, which means that Purdy's, he could pay off in the first half alone. Right now, the 49ers are heavy favorites, 7.5-point favorites, and the highest over-under of the week. I'm projecting Brock Purdy to have 250 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and he's going to be a top 10 fantasy quarterback. All right, the 6th player we are starting with ultimate confidence. That is Amari Cooper at the Washington Commanders. Right now, the Commanders give up the most points to fantasy wide receivers, on average about 40 points per game to wide receiver cores. Amari Cooper is a top 12 play for me this week. You can see the Commanders have been getting roasted to a crisp by every wide receiver that they play. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, both over 22 fantasy points. Malik Neighbors has his breakout game against the Commanders, 28 fantasy points. Jamar Chase has his breakout game versus the Commanders, almost 30 fantasy points. And last week, Marvin Harrison continued his great form, a touchdown, almost 16 fantasy points. And this defense, they are improving, I will say that, but they're still top 10 in passing yards allowed and total yards allowed and in points allowed to opposing offenses. The Amari Cooper bounce back, by the way, already happened. If you're only box score hunting, you probably won't have realized how good Amari Cooper was last week, but let's talk about it. In week 3, Amari Cooper has 12 targets, catches 2 touchdowns, over 27 points. In week 4, the box score says 4 catches, 35 yards. But the box score is going to completely remove the fact that Deshaun Watson found him butt-ass naked open down the field. He burnt his corner, and he caught a 82-yard touchdown that was called back due to holding. The most BS holding call I've seen this year. I have no idea why they called that. But the point is, that outlier will not always happen, right? There was a great game from Amari Cooper there. It was just some silly thing that the refs did that was out of his control. So Amari Cooper is going to be much, much better this week versus the Washington Commanders. I'm playing him everywhere I have him. I think he gets at least 6 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. I'm saying 20 PPR points. That's one of my most bold takes on this entire video. All right, man. What a bounce back for DeAndre Swift in week 4, and we are going to ride that wave into week 5 because it is a great matchup versus the Panthers, who currently give up the second most points to fantasy running backs, almost 29 points per game they're giving up to the position. DeAndre Swift, my RB20 on the week. The Panthers gave Alvin Kamara 22 points, J.K. Dobbins 20 points, Chase Brown had his best ever game as a professional, 23 fantasy points, and Zach Moss even got 17.8 fantasy points in the same game last week. The Panthers defense gives up top 5 in rushing yards allowed per game, total yards allowed per game, and total points allowed per game. Guys, they're the only team in the NFL allowing over 30 points per game, more than 4 touchdowns, almost 5 touchdowns per game. But more importantly, this is less about the matchup. It's very good, but it's more about the fact that I believe the Bears finally found their identity as an offense, and that is via the ground game. Just like Washington is doing with Jaden Daniels, they're establishing the run game. They're asking him to do a little bit less. Finally, Chicago is doing that with Caleb Williams. If you look at DeAndre Swift, in week 4, he has a season high in touches, 23 touches. And in week 4, Chicago's drop back rate, what's the drop back? Okay, that means I drop back and I'm going to pass the ball. That's my intention. So the percentage of plays where they dropped back was at 48%. In the first 3 weeks, they were hovering around 60 to even 70% drop back rate. They were asking Caleb to do so much. And last week, Caleb comes out and has a career low in passing attempts at 23. And then they play 12 personnel 30% of their snaps, which is a season high, which means they had 2 tight ends on the field at one time. Look, if this all sounds like gibberish to you, basically what I'm trying to say is that they were far more focused on the run game, and they were far more focused on asking Caleb to do less with the offense. And I think that was a formula for success. I think they continue. I believe DeAndre Swift will touch the ball at least 17 times. He'll have 70 plus yards and 14 plus PPR points. He's a solid start. At number 8, let's talk about T. Higgins. Yes, I know it's not been good, but we are going to continue to play T. Higgins. Baltimore is a top 10 matchup for your fantasy wide receiver. They gave Rashee Rice 17 points. They gave Devontae Adams 26 points, and he didn't even score a touchdown. And the Ravens in 2024 are giving up the 4th most passing yards per game. They are getting destroyed with their secondary. Their secondary completely fails them. They're up in games, and then the other offense is like, should we start to throw the ball, guys? Should we throw on this defense? Yeah, let's do it. And then they get back into the game, and the Ravens almost lose. It's like every single game. Look, I know it's not been good. The blow-up games for T. Higgins have not happened just yet, but since he's come back from injury, the utilization has been there, and I see a big game on the horizon. You can see here that Jamar Chase, since T. Higgins has come back, has 18% of the targets, and T. Higgins has 23% of the targets. T. Higgins has a higher average depth of target. He has a higher percentage of their air yards, end zone targets, etc. They are using T. Higgins in every way that you want to for him to be successful for fantasy football. It just hasn't turned into fantasy points. But I'm telling you, a blow-up game is on the way, and I think that could be versus Baltimore. Last year when he faced Baltimore, he had 8 catches, 89 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It was his best game in 2023. I think we could see something similar here in 2024. Of course, my projections are a little bit lower. 6 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown, 20 PPR points. All right, the 9th player that we're starting with confidence is Joe Money BAGGSS Mixon. The Texans missed Joe, and it is time to get him back into that lineup, okay? Buffalo gives up the most points to fantasy running backs. So far this year, James Conner had 19 points, Achane almost had 30, and Derrick Henry had 36 fantasy points. They give up the 3rd most rushing yards per game. And remember, the only game that Mixon was fully healthy and played was week 1, where he had 33 total touches. I believe this week he gets back on track, 100 plus total yards, 17 total PPR points, and a touchdown for sure. Put it on the board. And at number 10, I don't even want to put tight ends in this video. I'll be honest with you guys. But I'm just assuming that Evan Engram is going to come back this week. So we're going to make him the start of the week. Indianapolis gives up the 3rd most points to fantasy tight ends, 11.7 PPR points. They gave Cole Kmet 26 points, almost 100 receiving yards. And last week they gave Pat Freiermuth almost 17 points, and he also got into the end zone. And the Colts defense is top 7 in passing yards per game, and they give it the most yards per game as well. Look, I don't have high expectations for any tight end. I'm saying 5 catches, 50 yards, 10 points. He's not going to lose you your matchup, but he's going to be a solid option. All right, the next player we're going to talk about is Jordan Mason. And look, I hear you guys. Why would you not start Jordan Mason? But the title of this video is players that are going to dominate, that are going to go nuclear. And I just want to tell you guys, Jordan Mason is my RB1, the #1 running back in my rankings, point blank period, in week 5. So the reason I'm bringing up Jordan Mason is because I am telling you, there's not a single running back in fantasy football I would start over him. If you have Jordan Mason, he has got to be in your lineup. I don't care if you play in a 2-team league. Put him in there, all right? He's going to feast. The Cardinals give up the 5th most points per game to fantasy running backs. Jordan Mason has been on an absolute tear. He's dominating touches. He looks so efficient in a great offense behind a good offensive line, and they are heavy favorites, the Niners are, in the highest over-under of the week. The Niners are 7.5-point favorites, which means they could be running the clock out after halftime. We could be going into the 3rd quarter, and the Niners could be like, all right, let's waste 10 minutes on this drive and give Jordan Mason every single carry. So if you have Jordan Mason, I'm telling you, he's got to be in your lineups. I'm predicting at least 80 yards, a touchdown, and at least 16 PPR points. So those are the players that I believe are going to dominate this week. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do me a favor, hit that like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. And the last thing that I will say is if you have a question that you want to ask me, a start sit, a trade question, a team review, then check out the pinned comment. That's a link to our website where you can reach us at any time. I appreciate you for watching. Go win in week number 5, all up. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.